This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order Dominaria United right now by going to cardkingdom.com/needsahone or following the link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Needsahone, and today I'm continuing with my Dominaria United limited set review. So far we've looked at every multicolored, colorless, white, blue, and black card in the set, and today I'm continuing with a look at every red card. Tomorrow we'll take a look at every green card. Before we jump in, a few things to keep in mind. First, this is a limited review. That means I'm only talking about the viability of these cards in limited formats, which are draft and sealed. That also means I'm only talking about cards that appear in draft boosters. Also, I'm reviewing these cards ahead of time, so I am going to be wrong about some of them. That's the nature of a set review. I will be updating you all on my thoughts with videos throughout this limited season. Lastly, I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on cards in my set reviews, and if you're unsure what those grades mean, you can find an explanation in the description. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at our first red card. First up, it's Balduvian Berserker, which for 2 generic and a red is a 1/3 core Berserker at uncommon. It has Enlist. This is the first time we're seeing it in this video, so I'll read you what it does. As this creature attacks, you may tap a non-attacking creature you control without summoning Sickness. When you do, add its power to this creature's until end of turn. When Balduvian Berserker dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. This is a little bit clunky, but I think pretty solid overall. Without Enlist, a 3-mana 1/3 that does 1 to something when it dies is kind of okay, probably a C- at the very best. It can create 2 for 1 sometimes if there's an X1 around, but this has Enlist upside that is pretty significant. Even attacking with it as a 2/3 is a pretty big pain for your opponent. Obviously, if you can make it really big, it can be really sweet, but the cost of doing that and how slow it can be since you have to wait until both this and another creature don't have summoning Sickness makes me think it's probably just a C+. Next up, it's Chaotic Transformation, which for 5 generic and a red is a rare sorcery. It says exile up to 1 target artifact, up to 1 target creature, up to 1 target enchantment, up to 1 target planeswalker, and or up to 1 target land. For each permanent exiled this way, its controller reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a card that shares a card type with it, puts that card onto the battlefield, and then shuffles. It seems like red always gets some wacky chaotic rare that does cool stuff, but is unplayable and limited, and that's the case here. Obviously, this can result in you getting a bunch of upgraded permanents, but it can also result in you downgrading your permanents. Sure, the ideal thing is to exile tokens or cheap things and then upgrade them all, but actually creating a board state where that works out and making sure your deck actually does what you want it to isn't that easy. If you really like gambling, this card might be for you, but for every time it lets you cheat your best permanent into play, it will also effectively lose you the game. You can also exile your opponent's stuff, and if they have something insane on their side, obviously, you know there's a good chance you can downgrade it, but the situation is equally hard to manipulate in your favor when it comes to your opponent. If you get rid of their 6-mana 6/6 with Trample and replace it with like a 4/5 with Lifelink, you're not exactly doing it. So yeah, you can choose your opponent's best permanents and your worst permanents when you cast this that will maximize how well this works out for you, but the effect this actually has on the outcome of the game is usually not going to be in your favor, especially because you'll end up spending a turn just sort of switching things around. I think this is an F. Next up, it's Coalition Warbrute, which for 3 generic and a red is a 3/4 Minotaur Berserker at common with Enlist and Trample. An Enlist creature with Trample is pretty sweet. Even making this into a 5/4 or a 6/4, both of which are fairly realistic, is pretty nice. Of course, Enlist does make you tap a thing, and that's a real cost, but this definitely looks like it can be a very real creature for red decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it is Defiler of Instinct, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 4/4 Phyrexian Cavu. At rare, it's got First Strike. As an additional cost to cast red permanent spells, you may pay 2 life. Those spells cost red less to cast if you paid life this way. This effect reduces only the amount of red mana you pay. Whenever you cast a red permanent spell, Defiler of Instinct deals 1 damage to any target. A 4-mana 4/4 with First Strike is a B, and this has amazing upside like the others in the cycle. You can make it so you sort of pay Phyrexian mana for one of your red permanents, or really any red permanents you cast, which is pretty nice. And you also get an effect when you cast a permanent of the same color of the Defiler. In this case, you get to do 1 damage to something. That ability does always do something, whether you're picking off something small or hitting your opponent for 1. That said, it does feel like its permanent spell trigger is a bit weaker than what all the other Defilers can do. I'd much rather draw a card or make a 1/1 token or put a +1/+1 counter on my board than ping something, but it's still a bum. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Dragon Whelp, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 2/3 dragon. At uncommon, it's got flying, and you can pay red, and it gets +1/+0 until end of turn. If this ability has been activated 4 or more times this turn, sacrifice Dragon Whelp at the beginning of the next end step. This is a reprint and a pretty good limited card. 4 mana for a 2/3 flyer is not very good. That's like a D+ or a C-, but adding Fire Breathing makes a huge difference. You're not normally going to be buffing it so much that it gets sacrificed. You'll just be buffing it enough for it to be a very real clock on your opponent, and the fact it can buff its power also means it can trade with almost anything, especially because it doesn't get sacrificed right away when you buff its power too much. It waits until your end step. So it's a good attacker, a reasonable blocker, also kind of interesting alongside Enlist potentially because it can raise its power. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's the Elder Dragon War, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a rare enchantment saga. All the sagas in this set have read ahead, which means you can pick which chapter you start on. Obviously, you ignore the previous chapters when you choose chapter 2 or 3. Chapter 1 here says the Elder Dragon War deals 2 damage to each creature and each opponent. Chapter 2 says discard any number of cards, then draw that many cards. And chapter 3 says create a 4/4 red dragon creature token with flying. This looks really good. At worst, you can treat this as a 4 mana 4/4 flyer, and at best, you can generate some insane value out of the first 2 chapters before that. Chapter 1 is pretty situational, and I think you'll often skip it, except in situations where it hurts your opponent more than you, and when that is true, it will feel pretty awesome, so it's nice that you have the option of doing it, because when it is good, it's really good. Chapter 2, meanwhile, is a good way to reload your hand in the mid to late game. I think if you play this turn 4, you're maybe going to consider just doing Chapter 3 and getting the 4/4 dragon, because Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 oftentimes aren't going to be at their best at that stage of the game. I do think in the end this falls a little short of being a bomb. If you can get, maximum value out of all 3 chapters, it'll feel like an A+, but I'm skeptical you'll be able to do that consistently. The card does have a fail case as basically being a 4 mana 4/4 flyer, which would be like a B. And this is certainly better than that. I think it's a B+. I could definitely see this sneaking into bomb range if Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 are more effective than I'm thinking more often. Next up, it's Electrostatic Infantry, which for 1 generic and a red is a 1/2 dwarf wizard at uncommon. It's got trample, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. This is one of the premier payoffs for spell decks in this format. We've seen tramplers that get counters from spells in the past, but never one that is this efficient as a base. Obviously, this is something of a build-around, but it slots so easily into blue-red decks that I don't really think a build-around grade is necessary. What's nice is, even in your typical red deck in the format that will have 4 or 5 spells, it's still something you play that will be fine. I think I'm going to want to take these pretty highly because they have such a high ceiling. I'm giving them a B. Next up, it's Fires of Victory, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon instant. It has a kicker for 2 generic and a blue. This means you can pay an additional cost for an additional effect. If this spell was kicked, you draw a card. Fires of Victory deals damage to target creature or planeswalker equal to the number of cards in your hand. This is interesting. Obviously, it can be a really efficient removal spell, but there will also be times where you draw this and you don't have cards for it to matter. Even if you do kick it, there's a chance you're paying 5 to draw 1 and do 1, and that just isn't going to be enough. In the early game, it can kill lots of stuff, and if you're a control deck that often has a full grip of cards in the late game, it can always be potent, but that just doesn't work out that often in Limited. This is going to have a pretty wild range. The ceiling is amazing. Can you imagine paying 5 for this, drawing a card, and doing 5 damage to something is going to be really powerful. And I think you'll often pay 5, do 2 to something and draw a card, which is sort of reasonable, but it's not great. Obviously, if you have this card, you do start keeping cards in your hand, maybe a little more than you would otherwise, especially lands and stuff like that you don't really need. But I still don't love how wild the range on this card can be. It seems like it's going to be really good in the early game, and then, even though it has kicker, kind of worse in the late game. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Flowstone Infusion, which for 1 red mana is a common instant. It says target creature gets +2/-2 until end of turn. So it's fun to see Flowstone stuff back. This is a pretty nice card because it can function as a removal spell, and it also has the additional mode of being used as a trick. As we usually see with this type of card, you'll use it as a removal spell 95% of the time, and it does get into premium removal for me. It often just feels like shock, which is always a nice card to have. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Flowstone Cavu, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/3 Cavu at common with Menace, and you can pay 1 red, and it gets +1/-1 until end of turn. A 3-mana 2/3 with Menace is already pretty solid, so the fact that this can buff its power is pretty nice. This will be able to attack effectively on a whole lot of boards, since it can always threaten to be a 4/1, and it has to be blocked by 2 creatures, and that makes it pretty hard for your opponent to block it without it losing at least 1 creature. It also works pretty nicely with Enlist in situations where maybe it's not the best attacker. You could still pump it up to 4 and enlist it so that your attacking creature with Enlist hits a lot harder. I think this is a B-. Next up, it's Furious Bellow, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant. Target creature gets +3/+0 and gains first strike until end of turn, scry 1. Sure Strike is always a decent trick, and this is slightly better because it tacks on scry 1. Sure Strike is usually about a C-. It's a trick that really helps your creature win combat most of the time, assuming your opponent doesn't blow you out one way or another in response. But it doesn't have the flexibility of some of the other tricks in this format have, especially the 2-mana tricks that grant things like indestructibility and hexproof, which also makes those tricks useful for blanking removal. This just can't do that. It's probably about the same as Sure Strike. Scry 1 is definitely better than not having Scry 1, but it's not a huge difference. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's G2 Amplifier, which for 1 generic and a red is a 1/2 human wizard at common. It's got Kicker for 2 generic and a blue, and when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, you return target creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, the Amplifier gets +2/+0 until end of turn. This is a cool card, so if you don't kick it, it's a slightly weaker Kiln Fiend, which means that it can really thrive off of cheap spells and hit hard in the early game. Then in the late game, you can kick this thing and bounce a creature, which is an effect I always love. Adding to the board and subtracting from your opponents is quite good. I really want this to be a B-, but I think I'm letting my own affinity for this type of card push me in that direction, and I'm going to try to be a little more responsible and give this a C+. Next up, it's Goblin Picker, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 goblin at common, and you can pay 1 red and tap it to discard a card and draw a card. This has okay base stats, and rummaging can improve the quality of your draws, though rummaging is markedly worse than looting. Red also doesn't have a ton of graveyard stuff going on in the format, and that certainly hurts this card's stock a bit, but this can really fairly cheaply improve your draws in the late game, and that can sometimes mean the difference between winning and losing. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Hammerhand, which for 1 red is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature. When Hammerhand enters the battlefield, target creature can't block this turn. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has haste. This is a reprint, and it's a pretty solid aura for aggressive decks. If you know me, I normally don't love auras that don't somehow replace themselves. But there is another category of aura that I like, and that's one that's powerful enough for its low cost that a 2-for-1 is less of a problem, and Hammerhand definitely falls in that latter category. 1 mana to make something unable to block while also granting haste and +1/+1 is a really good rate, and will often make whatever attack you make on your turn far more powerful than your opponent expects. And even after that initial turn where it really does some work, the +1/+1 sticks around, which is pretty nice. All of that might sound like I think this is incredible. I don't, but it is a quality card for red aggro decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Hurler Cyclops, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 5/4 Cyclops at uncommon. You can pay 1 and sacrifice another creature to have it do 1 damage to any target. This seems pretty good. The stats are mediocre, but the activated ability can do some serious work, closing out games or making combat miserable for your opponent, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Herloon Battle Hymn, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon instant with Kicker for a white. It deals 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker, and if it was kicked, you gain 4. This is a great premium removal spell that you can turn into War Leader's Helix when you kick it, and that's pretty awesome. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Enthrall to the Pit, which for 3 generic and a red is a common sorcery. It has Kicker for 2 generic and a black. It says gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untap that creature. It gains haste until end of turn. If this spell was kicked, sacrifice that creature at the beginning of the next end step. There is definitely enough sacrifice stuff around in this format. We've seen some of it in this video. We saw some of it in the black video. There's enough of it around that this can work out as a card you play, but I do think, as usual, this sort of threat and effect needs a build-around grade. This sort of effect isn't usually going to be worth it unless you can sacrifice the creature you steal. And yes, you can kick this to make it do that all on its own, but 7 mana is a lot, and while that does make this card better because it can internally steal and sacrifice a creature, I don't think it has a drastic effect on how good the card is. In a regular red deck, this is probably a D. If you're really aggressive, this can work out sometimes just as a way to get a blocker out of the way and do more damage to your opponent, but the temporary nature of this card and its cost of 4 mana really limits how good it can be in Limited. But it's probably a C+ in a deck that has a few good sacrifice outlets. Next up, it's Jaya, Fiery Negotiator, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 4 loyalty legendary Planeswalker Jaya and Mythic Rare. She has a +1 that creates a 1/1 red monk creature token with prowess. She has a -1 that says exile the top 2 cards of your library, choose one of them, you may play that card this turn. She has a -2 that says choose target creature an opponent controls. Whenever you attack this turn, Jaya Fiery Negotiator deals damage equal to the number of attacking creatures to that creature. And she has a -8 that says you get an emblem with, whenever you cast a red instant or sorcery spell, copy it twice. You may choose new targets for the copies. So, she's a bomb. She can make bodies to protect her with her +1, draw you cards with her -1, and she can remove creatures with her -2. And I often say a Planeswalker needs to be able to do 2 out of those 3 things to be good. That is, draw you cards, be removal, or protect itself. And this has all 3. The -2 is maybe a bit situational as far as removal goes, and it is a little awkward that you probably want to be protecting her, and the -2 kind of wants you to attack with a bunch of stuff, but I still feel like those first 3 abilities will all be good in many situations, and her ultimate is really strong if you have a lot of red instants. It's not that realistic that you get there, but that's mostly because she'll probably end up winning you the game one way or another before you ever get to 8 loyalty. I'm giving her an A. Next up, it's Jaya's Fire Nato, which for 4 generic and a red is a common sorcery. It deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker, scry 1. Jaya's planeswalker card was really good. Her Fire Nato, not so much. This is a very clunky removal spell. 5 damage for 5 mana at sorcery speed is basically never impressive, and the upside here is pretty limited, with scry 1 the only other thing you get. Even when we see this card at instant speed these days, it isn't great, so a sorcery is kind of rough. The reason for this is you almost always end up spending more mana than your opponent did to kill the creatures this targets. Sometimes you end up paying less, but when you're paying 5, you can count on the fact that you're probably paying more than your opponent did, and you're also tapping all of your lands on your turn to do it. And that doesn't feel great. Now, this isn't unplayable or anything. It is a removal spell that playing one of doesn't feel like a complete disaster because, you know, you need removal and maybe you didn't get your lightning strikes and stuff, but it's only a C. It's nowhere close to premium removal. Next up, it's Keldon Flame Sage, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/3 human shaman. At rare, it's got Enlist, and when it attacks, you look at the top X cards of your library, where X is its power. You may exile an instant or sorcery card with mana value X or less from among them, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost. This looks pretty good. Obviously, you need some instants and sorceries in your deck, but that's not going to be a huge ask. We've seen that that's a theme in red in this video, and blue-red especially is going to be into spells. Enlisting this will feel particularly powerful because not only is it getting a good attack going, it probably also lets you cast a spell for free. You won't always hit something, of course, but I think once you're looking at the top 4 cards or so, and you have a deck that has a decent number of cheap instants and sorceries, you're going to have a reasonable chance at actually hitting something and casting it for free. This is the kind of creature that your opponent kind of has to block as soon as it attacks them, because if you get to attack with it more than once, things will seriously become a problem. Sometimes you'll be able to pump its power even more and cast a free spell, and that will just be ridiculous. And the great thing about all of this, you know, I'm talking about like the ideal case with this card, but the fail case for this card is that it's a 3 mana 2/3 with Enlist, which is probably like a C. So yeah, this is a pretty good card overall. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Keldon Strike Team, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/1 human warrior at common. It has Kicker for 1 generic and a white. When it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, you create 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens. As long as it entered the battlefield this turn, creatures you control have haste. This looks really good to me. If you don't kick it, it's a 3 mana 3/1 with haste that gives haste to your whole board the turn it comes down. Normally, giving haste to other things won't matter that much, but it could. Then when you kick it, you pay 5 mana, and you get 5/3 worth of stats spread across 3 bodies. This gets an extra bonus from the fact that red-white really wants to go wide and has lots of payoffs for doing it. Also keep in mind, because it has haste, it can actually be enlisted the turn it comes down, unlike most creatures, and sometimes that's going to be appealing because a 3/1 is probably going to die in combat. So yeah, this is a very good common. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Lightning Strike, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant. It's actually a common, there you go. It deals 3 damage to any target. So this is always great. 2 mana to do 3 to anything is very powerful. It can trade up when killing creatures, and the fact it can go to your opponent's face to close out a game is great. Giving this a B. Next up, it's Miria's Outrider, which for 4 generic and a red is a 4/4 elf archer at common with reach. It has Domain, which means you get some bonus based on the number of basic land types among lands you control. In this case, it deals damage to each opponent equal to the number of basic land types among lands you control when it enters the battlefield. A 5 mana 4/4 with reach is not something I'm in for. That's like a D+. The fact this does some damage when it enters the battlefield is an upgrade, and it will at least shock your opponent most of the time. And bolting them isn't out of the question either. You know, doing 4 or 5 even isn't out of the question because they have these common dual lands in the format with 2 basic land types. But, you know, the floor for this card is pretty bad, and while the ceiling is pretty good, it does take significant setup, and there's just way better things you could be doing with your Domain than making this do 4 damage to your opponent or whatever. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's Molten Monstrosity, which for 7 generic and a red is a 5/5 Hellion at common. It costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control, and it has Trample. So this will feel miserable if you have an empty or undersized board, and you kind of need at least a 3-power creature for this to feel like you're doing a good job. So it's kind of hard to imagine curve outs where this comes down super early. Unless you manage to have a 4-power creature as a 2 or 3 drop, you probably mostly play this on turn 5 when you're curving out, and while that's good, the fail case for the card is bad enough that I think this is just a C. Next up, it's Phoenix Chick, which for 1 red mana is a 1/1 Phoenix at uncommon. It's got flying and haste, it can't block, and whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, you can pay 2 red. If you do, return Phoenix Chick from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped and attacking with a +1/+1 counter on it. This is a great uncommon, and it's also adorable, and an early candidate for my favorite art in the set. Anyhow, yeah, well, 1 mana 1/1 with flying and haste that can't block is probably a C- or a C. Overall, it's a decent rate and a great place to put counters and things like that. But what really makes this card good is its ability to return from the dead as a 2/2. It's going to be a real menace if you can't exile it. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Rada's Firebrand, which for 1 generic and a red is a 3/1 human warrior at rare. When it attacks, target creature defending player controls with power less than Rada's Firebrand's power can't block this turn. And it has Domain, 5 generic and a red. It gets +2/+2 until end of turn. This ability costs 1 less to cast for each basic land type among lands you control. Activate only once each turn. This is a really good 2-drop. In the early game, it will be capable of shutting down the ability of most creatures to block, and even in the later part of the game, that attack trigger is no joke. And that's especially true because it has an activated ability that can buff it in the later part of the game, making it tougher to block and better at making it so things can't block. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's Runed Velt Hordemaster, which for 1 generic and a red is a 1/1 Goblin Warrior at rare. Other goblins you control get +1/+1, and when it or another goblin you control dies, you exile the top card of your library. If it's a goblin creature card, you may cast that card until the end of your next turn. Sort of like the Merfolk Lord we saw earlier in this week, this card looks amazing for Goblin decks and Constructed. Looks terrible in Limited. Even worse, I think, than the Merfolk Lord did. There aren't enough goblins in the set for this. There's 1 common goblin in red, Goblin Picker, which we just saw, and 1 goblin at common in black. So yeah, there's 2 uncommon goblins as well, and 1 rare goblin in addition to this, and that's just not enough for you to end up with the critical mass this card wants. If it was like a 2 mana 2/2, then it would be worth playing in a deck that just had like 2 goblins, but as is, it just isn't. A 2 mana 1/1 is an awful stat line, and it's not going to have upside that actually matters often enough to overcome that. You would need like 7 goblins in your deck to make this worth it, and you're just not going to get there. I think this is an F. Next up, it's Shivan Devastator, which for X and a red is a 0/0 Dragon Hydra at Mythic Rare, has flying and haste, and it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. This will never feel insanely efficient. Paying 4 mana for a 3/3 with flying and haste is definitely nice, and it's great that it scales all game long. You can also pick the exact right spot with it to get in for lethal. Sometimes it'll feel like a fireball. but I don't quite think this reaches bomb range. Haste does mean it can do something before your opponent untaps most of the time, but without trample, it isn't really guaranteed to do damage, even if you pay 1 billion mana. And if your opponent can untap and remove it, or worse, remove it before it even attacks, it isn't going to feel great. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's Smash to Dust, which for 1 generic and a red is a common sorcery with 3 options. You can destroy an artifact, you can destroy a creature with Defender, or you can do 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. Even with 3 modes, I don't really feel like this is something you want to main deck. There aren't enough artifacts in the format for that first mode to matter. There are defenders in the format and there's a defender deck, but there still aren't so many of them that you're always going to have a target for them. And the third option is maybe the one that's the most powerful because some opponents will have a bunch of X1s, but it's still narrow enough that there are going to be opponents you go up against where none of these 3 modes really comes up, and that means it's something you can't afford to have in your deck. It is, however, a pretty good sideboard card. If you go up against the Defender deck, which is usually going to have like 5+ defenders, suddenly it can remove those. If you go up against an opponent who has a lot of tokens and X1s, suddenly that mode's pretty good. There aren't going to be very many opponents where the first mode is enough to get it into the deck, but there might be opponents where you have a mix of targets for all 3 of these modes, in which case it's fine. But yeah, I think it's like a D as a main deck card and a C out of your sideboard. Next up, it's Sprouting Goblin, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 Goblin Druid at uncommon. It has Kicker for 1 green. When it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, search your library for a land card with a basic land type, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. This is, oh, and you can also pay 1 red mana and tap it, sack a land, and draw a card. This is pretty nice. You can play it on turn 2 if you need to, but kicking it makes sure you hit your 4th land drop, and even fixes your mana, which is nice with Domain. It also is nice that it has some late game utility since it lets you give up lands to draw cards. That's nice because drawing this late when you really don't need more lands can be pretty underwhelming, and, you know, the land you play you can just sacrifice on the next turn and get a card in exchange. This looks pretty good to me. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it is Squee, Dubious Monarch, who for 2 generic and a red is a 2/2 legendary Goblin Noble at rare. It has haste. When it attacks, you create a 1/1 red Goblin creature token that's tapped and attacking, and you can cast Squee Dubious Monarch from your graveyard by paying 3 generic and a red, and exiling 4 other cards from your graveyard rather than paying its mana cost. Squee is immortal, so we're going to see him every time we go to Dominaria, and here he is again. It's always fun to see him return, and this one is quite good. A 3 mana 2/2 haste that makes an attacking 1/1 token is something you'd always play, probably something like a C+, so the fact that he can just keep coming back from the graveyard, as all Squees can, is great. Now, he can be a bit tricky to bring back since he basically has Escape and you have to have some other cards to exile, but just bringing him back once is fairly doable. I'm giving him a B. Next up, it's Temporal Firestorm, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a rare sorcery. It has Kicker for 1 generic and a white and or 1 generic and a blue. Choose up to X creatures and or planeswalkers you control, where X is the number of times this spell was kicked. Those permanents phase out. Temporal Firestorm deals 5 damage to each creature and each planeswalker. Well, this is a massive bomb, one of the biggest ones in the set. In most situations, if you pay 7 for this, you're going to destroy the entire board except for your creature that you phased out. Basically, it will feel like Dune Blast, which was a massive bomb. Obviously, for this to be at its best, you need to be able to pay one of the kickers, and if you can pay both, it's completely insane, but 9 mana is asking a lot. Even if you don't kick it, it's still a powerful sweeper that can help reset the game in ways that most cards just can't, but it's the kicker upside on this card that makes it an absolutely insane bomb. It will be well worth 7 mana and basically impossible for your opponent to recover from. I'm giving this an A+. Next up, it's Thrill of Possibility, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant. As an additional cost to cast it, discard a card, draw 2 cards. This is a reprint we've seen before, and it tends to be fine in formats that have spell decks, and this is one of those. It triggers your spell payoffs while helping you find even more spells. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Twinferno, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon instant. It says choose one. When you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. Target creature you control gains double strike until end of turn. This is a neat modal spell. Both halves of it can be really good in the right situation, but you often find yourself unable to manufacture those situations. Jamming both modes together definitely helps though. Individually, each part of this card is usually like a D. Together, I'm willing to go as high as a C. Next up, it's Vyashino Branch Rider, which for 1 red mana is a 1/1 Vyashino Warrior at common. It has Kicker for 2 generic and a green. It has haste. If it was kicked, it enters the battlefield with 2+ and +1 counters on it, and you could pay 2 generic and a red to give it +2/+0 until end of turn. Like many creatures with Kicker, especially those at lower rarities, neither mode of this card is super impressive. You either get a Raging Goblin or a 4-mana Hill Giant with haste that has the upside of bumping its power. And bumping its power is pretty expensive. Anytime we see that cost 3, I get pretty skeptical. When this is a 1/1, for example, anything that blocks it will kill it, and sure, you can pump 3 mana into it to make whatever is blocking die, assuming it has 3 or less toughness, but you end up spending some insane mana to kill like a 2-drop, and that tempo matters. Once you kick it, it does obviously become a lot better and no longer needs to be buffed to actually have a relevant body in combat. It's also a haste creature, which works within the list pretty well. Still, this is probably just a C. Next up, it's Warhost's Frenzy, which for 2 generic and a black is an uncommon instant with Kicker for a single black. Creatures you control get +2/+0 until end of turn. If this spell was kicked, whenever a creature you control dies this turn, draw a card. This is nice to tack onto a Trumpet Blast effect, the Kicker upside, that is, because sometimes buffing your whole board isn't worth it because too much of your stuff dies. This makes sure they all get replaced. At the same time, it is sort of awkward because you often don't use a card like this unless you can do lethal on the spot, but I guess you'll be willing to cast this more often when you don't have lethal thanks to the upside. It does give it some upside as sort of a weird defensive spell too, since you can use it in response to removal or quadruple block their big creature and cast this so that you can replace them all. So it's a pretty interesting card with an insane ceiling, but it's situational enough that I have a hard time going above a C here. Next up, it's Yavimaya Steel Crusher, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 ape warrior at common with enlist. You can pay 1 and sack it to destroy an artifact. A 2-mana 2/2 with enlist is a card that you pretty much would always play, I think. Being able to make your 2/2 have higher power and thus make it so the best your opponent can do is trade in far more situations is pretty nice. So the additional upside of destroying artifacts is nice, even though this format doesn't have a ton of them. I think this is a C+. And our last red card is Yodia Declares War, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon enchantment saga with Rada Head, of course. Chapter 1 says create a 0/2 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying, named Ornithopter. Chapter 2 says tap any number of untapped artifacts you control. When you do, Yodia Declares War deals that much damage to target creature or planeswalker. And Chapter 3 says up to 1 target artifact you control becomes a creature with base power and toughness 4/4 until end of turn. This doesn't seem amazing, mostly because this format has a very serious shortage of artifacts, and that really takes away the power of the modality of most of these read-ahead cards, because you kind of have to start with Chapter 1, because you're not ultra likely to have an artifact in play to trigger the other stuff, or maybe you have 1, but that doesn't make enough of a difference. I think you can really only count on this making a 0/2 Thopter, pinging something, and then letting that Thopter attack as a 4/4 on a future turn. That is pretty good for 2 mana, even if you have to wait, and obviously if you do manage to get some decent artifacts to support this, it gets a lot better. And your opponent can kill the Thopter, and then Chapter 2 and 3 maybe don't matter, but you're still at least trading 1 for 1. Playing this on turn 2 in general seems like it feels pretty good. Its value does decrease as the game goes on, although I guess you're more likely to have more artifacts, but yeah, the number of playable artifacts in this set is just really low. This is an interesting card because in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, it would have been one of the best uncommons in the set, and probably in Brothers War, our next set, which is going to be artifact-centric, it would be insane. But this is neither of those sets. I'm giving this a C. So those are my thoughts on all the red cards in Dominaria United. Tomorrow I'll be back to talk about all the green cards, which will wrap up the card-by-card portion of the review, but there's a lot more content on the way about Dominaria United. There will be an archetype guide, a top list about the biggest bombs in the format, and draft videos in the very near future. In fact, I think the first draft video from the early access event will probably go up tomorrow. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review and a whole lot of other Magic content, don't forget to subscribe. If you're looking for the rest of the set review, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.